Well, good morning. Thanks for joining me this Tuesday. We have a longer passage in John 19. I'm going to actually read the whole thing from today's Bible reading, verses 1 through 16. So bear with me, but I feel like we see a theme in here on what happens on this whole interaction. And so let me go ahead and read it, and then we'll talk about it. So John 19. Then Pilate took Jesus and flogged him. And the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head and arrayed him in a purple robe. They came up to him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews," and struck him with their hands. Pilate went out again and said to them, "See, I am bringing him out to you that you may know that I find no guilt in him." So Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate said to them, "Behold the man." When the chief priests and the officers saw him, they cried out, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him." The Jews answered him, "We have a law, and according to that law he ought to die, because he has made himself the Son of God." When Pilate heard this statement, he was even more afraid. He entered his headquarters again and said to Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave him no answer. So Pilate said to him, "You will not speak to me? Do you not know that I have authority to release you and authority to crucify you?" Jesus answered him, "You have no authority over me at all, unless it had been given you from above." That right there is a whole interesting segment we could talk about, but we won't today. "Therefore he who delivered me over to you has the greater sin." From then on Pilate sought to release him, but the Jews cried out, "If you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. Everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar." So when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat at a place called the Stone Pavement, and in Aramaic, Gabbatha. Now it was the day of preparation of the Passover. It was about the 6th hour. He said to the Jews, "Behold your king." They cried out, "Away with him! Away with him! Crucify him!" Pilate said to them, "Shall I crucify your king?" The chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." So he delivered him over to them to be crucified. So we have this interaction going on with Pilate and Jesus, and with the crowd, with the chief priests and the leaders. And it's centered around Jesus as our king. Jesus as the king. That's what this whole premise is here. That's how they convince Pilate to crucify him, is by Jesus' claim to be king. And so we just find this very interesting dynamic, right? That Pilate finds nothing wrong with him. And yet the Jews themselves are the ones who reject Jesus. The Jews who hated the Roman authority, Roman governing authority in their territory, and yet they choose to reject their Messiah, and they claim Caesar as their king, the very people that they hated. That's very strong. Just a strong language. It's just a kind of a crazy turn of events that they're willing to claim Caesar as their king instead of Jesus. And that's really the same question that it comes down for us today, is have we accepted Jesus as our king or not? And that's the choice that they made here. Right? We think back to the Old Testament, and the Jews, when they got into the Promised Land, rejected Jesus as their king and asked for a king to rule them, an earthly king. And so God appointed Saul, which is what we were reading not too long ago in our Old Testament reading, and now we're on to David becoming king. Again, the Jews did the same thing. They rejected Jesus as their king and wanted an earthly king. And here, Jesus the Messiah comes, and they reject him as their king. The same choices being made. God is our one true king. Jesus is our king. And we have the same thing to ask ourselves today. I think back to Joshua asking the people when they're entering the promised land, choose this day, on this day, choose whom you will serve. Choose today whom you will serve. Will it be your own sense of things that you give your life to, your own things that you find important, or are you going to allow Jesus to be your king and to rule your life? Even the Pilate's men, when they were beating Jesus, they put a crown of thorns on him and a purple robe, and so they're mocking this idea of Jesus as the king. And then Pilate brings him out and sets it before them and said, "Behold your king." And they said, "He's not our king, Caesar's king." And gosh, that's it. That's what we have today. Jesus is king of our lives or not. Are we going to bow before him, kneel before our king, and allow him to rule our lives, and that we trust his control and his sovereignty? Or are we going to be like the Jewish people and reject him as our king and miss our opportunity and miss who he is and miss who he is in our lives? And so as I was noticing kind of this theme in the passage today, and the question we ask ourselves, the song King of My Heart just kept coming into my mind, because it's really the question I was asking: is Jesus the king of my heart, or is he not? And so then that song just kept playing in my mind, and some of the lyrics of that song, each section starts with "Let the king of my heart," and it's this acknowledgement that Jesus is the king of my heart. Let the king of the heart be the mountain where I run, the fountain I drink from. Let the king of my heart be the shadow where I hide, the ransom for my life. Let the king of my heart be the wind inside my sails, the anchor in the waves. And then the chorus, of course, goes on to say, he is good, and it repeats that. And we all, especially, going through this coronavirus, and we keep coming back to that, but it's changed our lives and turned it upside down. And yet we sometimes need to come back to this statement of you are good. And whether or not we're feeling that Jesus is good at the moment, or we're wrestling with things, or we're frustrated, we can settle back on this, that God is good. He is good in our lives. And so this song was just running through my heart today as I was reading this, of I want the king of my heart to be the mountain where I run, to be the shadow where I hide. He is the ransom for my life, to be the wind inside my sails as I wrestle with the change of life with the virus. And he is good. He is good. And the lady who wrote this, Sarah McMillan, alongside her husband, this is what she said about the song that she wrote. She said, "This song is about the tension we often find ourselves in this life. At the time I wrote this song, I was processing the divorce of my parents, and at the same time experiencing the overwhelming joy of having children of my own. Both experiences changed my identity so deeply. I wrote King of My Heart to remind myself there was no joy or sorrow that could dilute the pure goodness of who God was. Everything I thought I lost could actually be found in his goodness." And that's just such good truths for our lives. And so I'm going to include a link, of course, to this song. You can look it up by them. I'm going to share it from a band called Cutlass that also performs it, and I just really like their version myself, so I'm going to share their version with you today. But just go and process that song and ask yourself, is Jesus the king of my life? Have I made that choice with my mind, but also with my heart? Is he the king of my heart? Do I let him rule and be in place of authority there? Or do I allow my own personal desires and wants and needs to be the king of my heart? Or do I trust Jesus to be the king? Or am I going to reject him like the Jews? Thank you so much for joining me today. My hope and prayer is that Jesus is the king of your heart and the king of your life. And of course, if he's not, that you could stop and reflect on that and ask yourself that question. And it's never too late to give your life to him. My hope and desire is that we would all want to give our lives to him, to have him be the king of our life and the king of our heart. And so dive into John 19 and the following crucifixion of what Jesus did for you. We're going to continue to probably look at that, as that's where we're at in our reading. Feel free to ask any questions. But we would love, if you don't know Jesus personally, to turn your life over to him today and allow him to be the king of your heart. So again, thank you for joining me. Hope you have a great rest of your day. God bless.